fantasy I'd like to tell you is about the relationship between the mind and the body. It explores the idea that if the universe, if existence is an unfathomable thought in the mind of the Godhead, then what is the relationship between that and our bodies? What purpose do our bodies serve, right? Why do we have them? What do they do that couldn't be accomplished by mind at large, to use the expression that was used by Aldous Huxley in his book The Doors of Perception. So before we get into the fantasy proper, I want to just make an intro, if you will. We as human beings, every time we want to understand something, some system, some object, we want to understand it better, we go about it through a methodology we call analysis. We basically take it apart. For instance, if we are studying anatomy and we want to understand how the human body works, the way we do it is we cut it up, we take it apart, we try to separate its individual systems, the heart, the circulatory system, the stomach, the intestines, and the digestive system on the other hand, the brain and the nervous system. So we separate a whole into component parts, and by doing that we get in a position to understand better how the whole thing works. This is how we go about it. Our method for understanding, analysis, entails dividing things up and limiting our attention, focusing our attention on each one of these separate parts at a time. Now, going back to our fantasy, what is the relationship between mind at large, the mind of the Godhead, if you will, where the entire universe plays out as a thought pattern, if you will, and the physical body? What is the role of the physical body? The fantasy is that the body is an instrument of mind to analyze itself. Through the body, mind is in a position to focus its attention on different parts of its own phenomenology, of its own thoughts, if you will, at a time. What the body allows mind to do is to cut aspects of itself out, to separate aspects of itself and place its attention on each one of these separate aspects, one at a time. This allows mind to investigate itself, according to this fantasy. Just in the same way that anatomists are much better able to understand the body by looking at separate parts of the body at a time. And in the process of looking at each part, they are oblivious to all the other parts. The same thing in our fantasy here. In the process of focusing its attention to a segment of itself, through the body, mind becomes oblivious of everything else, all the rest of the phenomenology that is going on in the mind of the Godhead, if you will. Not only across space, but across time as well, in the past, in the future, in the present, across the universe. So, as an instrument of analysis, according to this little story of ours today, the body limits conscious perception to a particular locale in space-time, if you will, allowing for this analysis, allowing for mind to sort of, if you will, step out of itself and look at a segment of itself, instead of being overwhelmed by that unfathomable experience of everything happening here and now, all at once, all at the same time, which precludes any possibility for mind to understand itself, for mind to figure out what it is. So the body is pretty good at this job. If you think of it, the first thing that comes to mind is how the body splits out the categories of perception. So we have the visual category, things we see. We have the auditory category, things we hear. And the body frames it in such a way that the experience of seeing is different and separate from the experience of hearing, which in turn is different and separate from the experience of feeling through the skin, tactile feeling, which is different from the experience of tasting or smelling. So already here you immediately see this analysis capability of the body, its ability to separate perception into separate categories, so we can look at each category individually. Maybe only somebody who has synesthesia is more able to understand the alternative, to understand how things would be without this ability of the body. You would, for instance, taste sounds. We would hear images. We would smell photographs. All of these things would be conflated together, which, according to this fantasy, is the natural state of mind, is the primordial state of the Godhead, which the body then is able to split apart into all these different perceptual categories that we know. But it's not only about perception, it's about cognition as well. It's about our ability, for instance, to separate the beauty of a sacrifice combination in a game of chess, which is beautiful for chess players who appreciate the game. Separate that kind of beauty from the kind of beauty that you experience when you're looking at a Van Gogh painting, for instance, which is again very different from the kind of beauty that we experience when we listen to a Bach fugue, which is very different from the kind of beauty that we experience when we are making love to the person we love. All these things get separated out through the body, so they can be looked at individually and perhaps compared later, but we do not experience these things as one synesthetic apotheosis of conflated perception and cognition, if you will. And that is the role of the body, according to this fantasy. In this sense, time and space are themselves creations of the body. They are physiological. They are the output of the physiological process that takes place in our bodies, because time and space are necessary as the canvas onto which the body will separate out experience in different categories. The category of the past, the present and the future, the categories of left and right, up and down, back and forth, and so on. It is this canvas of space-time that allows us, if you will, to separate out the cards of existence onto different piles, onto different decks, so we can give them labels and we can perform analysis, if you will. The consequence of that, in the context of this fantasy, is that if the body is no more, then time and space are also no more, to the extent that they are the output of the body. So when we ask ourselves, well, what will happen when I die? The question only makes sense from the point of view of a working body, because it's a question that begs the existence of time. What will happen after I die? It's an event in the future. In a state of mind not constrained by the body, not constrained by this mechanism of analysis that creates space and time, the very question would be senseless. The question makes no sense. What will happen to me after I die? It's like asking what is the color of the word yesterday, or something equally absurd. The question doesn't make sense. Because you see, there is a very fundamental way in which living an experience fully is mutually exclusive with understanding the experience. To understand something requires a kind of standing out of it, a kind of taking a step back and looking at it from the outside, so you can formulate thoughts about it as a witness. Of course, the moment you step out of it, you stand outside of it, you're no longer living it fully, you become an observer. So while this standing outside of it is necessary for understanding, it on the other hand precludes a full absorption, a full living of the experience, if you will. So according to this fantasy, you can never live it fully and understand it fully at the same time. The all-at-onceness quality of this experience precludes one of the two, either the understanding or the living of it, if you will. And that gives us a hint in the context of this little story about the role of the body. The body allows us to stand outside of that overwhelming all-at-once experience and take in one part at a time within this physiologically created canvas of space-time that the body uses to spread out the variety of experience. In whatever side you are of this dichotomy, you crave for the other, according to this fantasy. If you've found yourself in a position of intellectual understanding, some intellectual understanding about what's going on, if you have managed to create some mental models that are to some extent satisfactory to you about the nature of reality and the nature of the self, and the nature of whatever it is that is going on right now, if you find yourself in that position, it is very likely that you will be craving, on the other hand, for a more intense, fulfilling and complete living of your own true nature, that you will be craving more contact with yourself, more proximity with that which you truly are. And at the same time, if you are in contact with yourself, if you are in contact with the matrix of being, with the earth, nature, the ground of existence, if you will, the source from which all patterns of universal dynamics are emerging, if you are in contact with that, you will very likely crave for a certain understanding of it. You will crave for the ability to articulate to yourself, what is it that's going on? What is it that you are? What is happening? Where is it going to? Where did it come from? What is it for? While immersed in that unfathomable integral experience of the matrix of nature, if you will, you might be craving for that understanding. How to find a balance between these two poles, according to this little fantasy, is the lapis philosophorum, right? It is the ultimate goal. It is the thing that perhaps we are all consciously or unconsciously shooting for. Causality, in the context of this story, could be seen also as an invention of the human body, of the human mind. One thing causing the other is a projection of mind. It's a story we tell ourselves. It may not have a real existence as such. You might ask, oh, well, what is the alternative if there is no causality, if one thing is not causing the other, right? Well, the fantasy here is that all of existence is the unfolding of a thought pattern, the unfolding of a pattern. And causality is the illusion you have when you are unable to see the entire pattern, when your perception and cognition is confined to a small local part of that pattern unfolding. Alan Watts had this wonderful analogy that illustrates this extremely well. He says the following: imagine that you are looking through a slit in a fence. So you only see the fence, there's this narrow little slit, and you're looking through it. And imagine that on the other side of the fence, a snake goes by, in such a way that looking through the fence, you first see the head of the snake, and a little while later, the tail of the snake. And imagine that you don't know what a snake is. You have no clue how the body of a snake looks like. You have never seen one. You don't know what it is. So from your perspective, every time the snake goes by, you see a head, and a little while later, a tail. Every single time, a tail follows a head. Since you don't know what a snake is, you may be tempted to conclude that the head causes the tail, because every time you see a head, a little while later, you see the tail. You see, the temptation to come up with this abstract concept that we call causality is an immediate consequence of the fact that you do not see the whole pattern. You do not see the whole snake. If you were able to see the whole snake, it wouldn't cross your mind to imagine that the head caused the tail. It is merely the unfolding of a pattern, namely the snake's body. Now imagine that the body does its work so well that your attention is so limited, localized and focused on one specific part of the entire phenomenology that is taking place in the mind of the Godhead, that from your narrow perspective, you think there is such a thing as causality. You think that the head of the snake causes the tail of the snake, because you're limited in your apprehension of that global pattern. But if you were no longer limited by the tool of analysis that we call our bodies, it would become instantly obvious to you that everything that is going on is actually the unfolding of an unfathomable pattern, that there is no such a thing as causation. Causation is an artifact of the analysis tool that we use in order to try to understand what is it that we are.